Today, we're diving into the most controversial episodes of 80s television that time almost forgot. But trust me, the kids who watched them never did. These weren't your typical, very special episodes about saying no to drugs. Oh no, these were the episodes that had censors working overtime, advertisers pulling out, and parents wondering if they should change the channel. From the never-aired episodes that were too shocking for primetime to the behind-the-scenes scandals that were darker than anything on screen, we're uncovering the stories that the networks hoped you'd forget. And hey, before we time travel back to the Reagan era, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into America's most fascinating decades. Plus, drop a comment and let me know. What's the most shocking thing you remember seeing on TV as a kid? Alright, let's roll back to the decade of big hair, bigger scandals, and television that pushed boundaries in ways you won't believe. The 1980s were weird, folks, and I mean weird. On one hand, you had this massive surge of conservative Reagan-era family values, the whole Morning in America thing. But on the other hand, television executives were desperate for ratings and controversy sells. This created what I like to call the moral panic paradox of 80s TV. Networks wanted to appear wholesome and family-friendly, but they also needed to grab eyeballs in an increasingly competitive landscape. Cable was starting to emerge. VCRs were changing how people consumed content, and suddenly the three major networks had real competition for the first time. Enter the very special episode format. You know, those episodes where your favorite sitcom characters would suddenly deal with heavy topics like drug abuse, alcoholism, or stranger danger. It was basically the network's way of saying, "See, we're socially conscious," while still keeping their regular programming safely sanitized. But here's what's fascinating, and this is where our research gets really juicy. The episodes that caused the most controversy weren't always the ones that made it to air. Sometimes the biggest scandals were the scripts that got killed before they ever reached your living room. The networks had discovered this brilliant formula: dedicate 1 or 2 episodes per season to trauma, wrap it up with a clear moral lesson, then return to business as usual the next week. It satisfied the moral guardians while keeping the controversy contained. Pretty clever, right? But sometimes, oh sometimes, things went off script in ways that nobody could control. Take shows like The Cosby Show and Family Ties. These programs set this incredibly high moral standard for what an American family should look like on television. Everyone was aspirational, loving, and morally pure. It was what media critics called an endless onslaught of sugar. This created a vacuum. Audiences were craving something, anything, that felt real and transgressive, which is exactly why shows like Married with Children, which debuted in 1987, could thrive by being the complete opposite of everything the Huxtables represented. But the real controversies? They were happening behind the scenes, in network boardrooms, and sometimes right on set, in ways that would shock you more than anything that made it to broadcast. This is where things get really interesting, and honestly, pretty disturbing. The deepest forms of censorship in the 80s didn't happen through public protests or boycotts. They happened in quiet executive decisions to kill episodes before they ever saw the light of day. Let's start with the facts of life. Now, if you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember this show as being pretty wholesome. 4 girls at a boarding school learning life lessons from their house mother, Mrs. Garrett. Sure, they tackled some serious topics, but always within safe boundaries. In 1988, they aired an episode called The First Time, which was about Natalie losing her virginity. This caused absolute panic among NBC executives. They had to put warnings before the episode. Lisa Whelchel, who played Blair, refused to participate because of her personal objections, and it became this huge media circus. But here's the kicker, and this is information that rarely gets talked about. There was reportedly another script that NBC refused to air at all. We're talking about a complete ban. The network executives were so horrified by the content that they buried it forever. Think about that for a second. They were okay with discussing teenage sex for a ratings boost, but there was something so controversial that they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Based on the era and the context, we're probably talking about storylines involving unplanned pregnancy, abortion, or sustained addiction, topics that would have completely destroyed the show's family-friendly brand. This demonstrates something crucial about 80s television that we often forget. The real censorship happened in the shadows. These lost scripts represent the true boundaries of what was acceptable, and they were erased from history so completely that we don't even know what we're missing. Now, let's talk about The Twilight Zone. I know, the original series was from the 60s, but bear with me because this gets weird. In the 80s, when all these classic shows were being syndicated and shown in reruns, there was an episode called The Encounter that just disappeared. This episode starred George Takei, Sulu from Star Trek, and it dealt with racial hatred and wartime guilt between a Japanese-American character and a bitter World War II veteran. The story was so intense and racially charged that after its single original airing in 1964, it was systematically withheld from syndication for over 50 years. What makes this relevant to our 80s story is that networks in the Reagan era were so sensitive to potential racial controversy that they quietly purged their archives of older content that might stir up trouble. This wasn't just censorship of new content. This was historical revisionism, making sure entire generations of viewers never saw certain stories because they were deemed too inflammatory. The scary part? Most viewers never even knew these episodes existed. The censorship was so effective that it created these massive blind spots in television history. Okay, so we've talked about the episodes that never made it to air, but what about the times when real-world chaos invaded the carefully controlled world of television? These are the stories that prove how vulnerable the entire system really was. November the 22nd, 1987, Chicago. Two different television stations are broadcasting their regular programming when something absolutely insane happens. Someone hijacks the airwaves. For about 30 seconds, viewers saw a figure dressed like Max Headroom. You remember? That weird computer-generated character. But this version was distorted, creepy, and completely unauthorized. The intruder delivered nonsensical audio over bizarre visuals, including what appeared to be a simulated spanking scene. Now, this might sound kind of silly today, but think about what this represented. This was 1987. There was no internet, no social media, no way for random people to reach mass audiences. Television was this sacred, controlled space that only networks could access. And suddenly, some unknown person had cracked the system and was beaming their weird message into thousands of homes. The sports anchor at WGN, who was broadcasting live when it happened, captured the moment perfectly. Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I. That helplessness, that total confusion, revealed just how fragile the entire broadcast infrastructure really was. They never caught the person who did it. Never. To this day, it remains this perfect piece of 80s chaos. A reminder that even the most controlled systems could be vulnerable to random acts of technological anarchy. But here's where things get really dark. And honestly, this is the part of the story that still gives me chills. Remember Different Strokes? Of course you do. Arnold Jackson, Willis, Mr. Drummond. What you talking about, Willis? The show was famous for its very special episodes, and none was more acclaimed than The Bicycle Man in 1983. This two-part episode dealt with child sexual abuse and was praised at the time for its professional, serious handling of an incredibly difficult topic. Gordon Jump, the lovable station manager from WKRP in Cincinnati, played a predator who tried to abuse Arnold and his friend Dudley. The episode ended with Conrad Bain breaking the fourth wall to give viewers information about reporting suspected abuse. It was considered a high watermark for socially conscious television. Critics loved it, educators used it in schools, and it's still referenced today as an example of how to tackle serious issues in family programming. But here's the horrifying irony that nobody talked about at the time. While they were filming this episode about child abuse, one of the show's young stars, Todd Bridges, was being sexually abused by someone connected to the production. Bridges later revealed that he was simultaneously being victimized by a producer/publicist during his time on the show. He described filming The Bicycle Man as a very hard week because of what he was experiencing in real life. Think about the psychological horror of that situation. Here's a kid actor being asked to perform scenes about the very trauma he was living through, while the adults around him praised the show for its awareness and sensitivity. The episode's narrative success functioned as a perfect mask for the systemic abuse happening behind the scenes. It's a devastating example of how Hollywood could preach moral lessons to America's families while perpetrating the exact crimes they were condemning. This is the kind of story that changes how you watch television forever. It makes you realize that sometimes the most important stories weren't the ones being told on screen. They were the ones being hidden behind the cameras. Now, not all 80s TV controversy came from moral panic about serious topics. Sometimes the biggest scandals came from shows that deliberately thumbed their nose at the wholesome family values the decade was trying to promote. Let's talk about You Can't Do That on Television. If you were a cable kid in the 80s, you probably remember this Canadian sketch comedy show that aired on Nickelodeon. On the surface, it looked like harmless children's programming. Kids doing silly skits, getting slimed, the usual stuff. But here's what made it subversive. Because it aired on cable, it largely flew under the radar of the moral watchdogs who were scrutinizing the major networks. And the writers took full advantage of this freedom in ways that would blow your mind. They had this running gag where they'd announce fake shows that will not be seen at this time. These weren't your typical G-rated kids show jokes. We're talking about announcements like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood Pusher, suggesting that America's most beloved children's host was a drug dealer. They got political with gags like George Bush shoots the wrong quail, a reference to Dan Quayle, and Rambo shoots the Ayatollah. They even went after other children's programming with dark jokes about Kermit the Frog as roadkill and the Muppets getting stuffed. The fact that this content could slip through on cable while sitcoms on the major networks were being heavily scrutinized reveals something crucial about 80s censorship. It was platform dependent. Non-broadcast venues were seen as less culturally critical, so content that would have been banned immediately on NBC or ABC could air on cable with minimal controversy. But the real anti-establishment weapon of the decade was Married with Children. When this show premiered in 1987 on the brand new Fox network, it was designed to be everything that The Cosby Show and Family Ties weren't. Al and Peg Bundy were miserable, their kids were disasters, and nobody learned heartwarming lessons at the end of each episode. The show was deliberately abrasive and problematic. It was Fox's cultural weapon against the moral purity that dominated primetime television. Al Bundy sold women's shoes and resented his family. Peg was lazy and sexually aggressive. Their teenage daughter was promiscuous, and their son was a budding sociopath. Conservative groups were outraged, family values organizations called for boycotts, parents wrote angry letters to affiliates, and you know what? It worked perfectly. The controversy was built into the show's DNA, and it succeeded commercially precisely because it was transgressive. It offered viewers what one critic called a savory dish in the midst of an endless onslaught of sugar. But here's what's fascinating, because Married with Children ultimately won the cultural battle and became a long-running success, we tend to forget just how shocking it was when it first aired. The initial conservative outrage seems quaint now, but at the time, this show represented a genuine threat to the moral order that the 80s were trying to maintain. The show's consistent satire became its identity, which is completely different from the episodic approach of very special episodes. Instead of containing controversy to 1 or 2 episodes per season, Married with Children made controversy its entire brand. And it proved something important. American audiences were hungry for alternatives to the endless positivity and moral instruction that had dominated 80s television. Sometimes, the most subversive thing you could do was just be honest about how dysfunctional real families could be. As the 80s wound down and we headed into the 90s, something shifted in how television created controversy. It became less about moral panic and more about calculated commercial exploitation, especially when it came to emerging social issues. Let me tell you about a moment that changed television forever, even though most people have completely forgotten about it. February 1991. L.A. Law was this prestigious primetime legal drama that tackled serious social issues with intelligence and nuance. In an episode called He's a Crowd, something unprecedented happened. 2 female characters shared an intimate kiss on screen. C.J. Lamb, who was openly bisexual, kissed her colleague Abby Perkins, who identified as heterosexual. This was heralded as the first same-sex kiss on U.S. primetime television. Groundbreaking, right? Well, here's where it gets complicated, and where we see the true power structure of 80s and early 90s television revealed in all its ugly glory. The public reaction was actually pretty mixed. NBC received about 80 calls, split roughly half and half between positive and negative. But the economic backlash was swift and devastating. A handful of advertisers immediately pulled their commercials from the broadcast. And that was it. Game over. The producers quickly retreated. The planned relationship between CJ and Abby was dropped. Abby ended up with a man, and CJ was written off the series. The whole storyline disappeared like it never happened. This incident reveals something crucial that we often forget about 80s television. The most effective censor wasn't the viewer, wasn't the activist group, wasn't even the network executives. It was the advertiser. The threat of economic withdrawal could instantly kill any storyline, no matter how carefully crafted or socially important. But here's the really insidious part. The network's cynical response to this controversy created a template that would be used throughout the 90s. They had accidentally invented what became known as the lesbian kiss episode. This became a predictable trope, a temporary, visually shocking stunt guaranteed to generate publicity and ratings during sweeps week, only to be safely reversed in the next episode to appease advertisers. It was controversy as a marketing tool with no real commitment to the social issues being exploited. And think about this. While the kiss is usually remembered as a lesbian moment, C.J. Lamb was actually introduced as bisexual. The swift erasure of her storyline and departure from the show effectively flattened genuine, complex representation into a simple publicity stunt. This pattern would repeat over and over throughout the 90s. shows would introduce LGBTQ plus characters or storylines just long enough to generate headlines, then quietly write them out when the commercial pressure became too intense. It's a perfect example of how the controversy-driven model of 80s television evolved into something even more cynical: controversy as a disposable commodity. Before we wrap up our journey through the most controversial 80s TV moments, I want to talk about something that connects all these stories: the role of technology in both creating and controlling controversy. The 80s were this fascinating transition period. You still had the big three networks dominating the airwaves, but cable was emerging, VCRs were changing how people consumed content, and for the first time, audiences had real alternatives to traditional broadcast television. Think about it. In the 70s, if an episode was controversial, you could just not air it again, and most people would forget it existed. But with VCRs, viewers could record episodes and share them. Syndication meant that controversial content could resurface years later in different markets. The Max Headroom hijacking was the ultimate example of how technology could completely bypass traditional gatekeepers. Some random person with the right equipment could literally hijack the airwaves and beam their message directly into people's homes. It was every network executive's worst nightmare made real. But technology was also being used to erase history. The systematic removal of episodes like The Encounter from The Twilight Zone. Syndication packages shows how digital archiving could be used to make controversial content disappear more completely than ever before. And here's something that might blow your mind. A lot of the most controversial 80s TV content has never been digitized or made available online. Those lost scripts, banned episodes, and pulled storylines exist only in network archives and private collections. In many ways, they're more inaccessible now than they were 40 years ago. This creates a weird situation where we're simultaneously living in an era of infinite access to information and permanent digital records, while also experiencing unprecedented historical erasure. The controversies we know about are the ones that were documented and preserved. The ones that were successfully suppressed? They might as well have never existed. It makes you wonder what other stories are out there, sitting in filing cabinets and storage facilities, waiting to be rediscovered. So here we are, folks. We've taken this wild journey through the most controversial episodes of 80s TV that time almost forgot. From the never-aired scripts that were too shocking for prime time to the behind-the-scenes scandals that were darker than anything on screen, we've uncovered stories that reveal just how complex and hypocritical the entertainment industry really was. The biggest takeaway? The real controversies weren't always the ones that made headlines. Sometimes the most shocking stories were the ones that were successfully buried. The episodes that never aired, the actors who were victimized while preaching safety to America's children, the systematic erasure of content that challenged social norms. The 80s taught us that controversy could be contained, packaged, and sold as entertainment. But they also showed us that real transgression, the kind that actually challenges power structures, would be met with swift and decisive censorship. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of 80s television, make sure you're subscribed to Star Spangled Nostalgia. We're always digging up forgotten stories from America's most fascinating decades. And trust me, we're just getting started. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and give this video a thumbs up if it made you see your childhood TV shows in a completely different light. Thanks for taking this journey with me, and I'll see you next time for another trip through the decades that made America. Until then, keep questioning what you think you know about the past, because the real stories are usually way more interesting than the official versions.